Hello and welcome to the final of our four-part pre-budget economy series, The Growth Deficit Balance. We have in the past few episodes discussed how the government should implement its farm focus or its infra push. Today we have a panel of economists who closely track every number in that budget table grid to tell us what are the big numbers we need to concentrate on, what will make for a credible budget. I have with me Ashima Goyal, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Samiran Chakraborty, the chief economist at Citi India, Deepali Bhargava, the economist from Credit Suisse, and Sajid Chenoy, the economist from JP Morgan India. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a 50-50 house. Thank you very much for joining us today. Ashima, let me start with you. Which is that one or two or three big numbers that you will watch out for?
Yeah, I will look at the composition of government expenditure, I think. That's the most important. I would like to see a lot of spending on infrastructure and on agriculture also from the infrastructure point of view. And some maintenance of, I would also look at the revenue numbers to see, because we are expecting some improvement in direct tax collection. And also the GST numbers. So a lot of reforms have been undertaken.
Yep.
We would like to see a picture of that in this budget. And rather than populism, focus on infrastructure and productivity improvements through the compositional effects.
I have actually a wide range of estimates from experts on what will be this year's indirect tax revenue. I have one person telling me that it would be minus 1%, 1% telling me it would be minus 8% vis-a-vis target, and 1% telling me that it will be plus 1% vis-a-vis target. You know, tax revenues for the current year itself, where do you stand, Samiran?
For FY18, the reason why you are possibly getting a wide variety of estimates on where the tax revenues could be is on the indirect tax side. The seasonality that we have witnessed in earlier years in excise tax collection in March, where the March number used to be almost double the February number, whether the same amount of seasonality is going to be seen in this year's GST collections or not is one open question. The other open question is that whether the March GST collection will be accounted for in this year's budget versus next year's budget. And the third open question is that the almost 30% of unallocated IGST, how much will it be on March 31st? Because on a cash accounting system, that unallocated GST to some extent gets calculated as part of center's revenue. So because of these uncertainties, it's becoming very difficult to predict a more clearer number on the indirect tax collection for FY18. For direct tax collection, things are relatively much better. We are tracking the expected run rate, in fact, maybe doing a tad better than what we were. So if we get some clarity on the indirect tax numbers, then we'll probably know for sure that whether we're going to meet that target or not. We are working with an assumption that apart from the 13,000 crore shortfall which we would see because of the excise duty cut on petrol diesel, we'll probably see another 15,000 crore shortfall coming out of GST. So that's the net shortfall that we are working with for FY18.
You're working with a shortfall of, say, 1% on indirect tax?
No, much lower, 0.2% 0.2% of GDP shortfall for indirect taxes. Okay,
so indirect taxes did 8.6 lakh crore in FY17, and the expectation is that it should have done 9.3 lakh crore. There comes the problem. Deepali, what are your numbers in terms of tax collections, direct and indirect, for the current year? Do you expect GST collections and therefore overall tax revenues to meet targets?
Right. So, Lata, for the indirect tax collections, we have a 0% year-on-year growth in our revised estimates. And we are expecting a pickup in the next year, but overall, assuming that indirect tax is about 0%, it doesn't grow at all compared to last year. We have a total receipt shortfall of about 0.9 trillion, almost a trillion shortfall this year. So some part of it is obviously coming from indirect taxes, because GST is going to be only for 8 months. And not 9 months, so we're assuming the March number doesn't come in, doesn't get accounted for in this year, and we've already assumed that the unallocated IGST is going to the center. So I think we have some bit of optimism already built into the numbers. So indirect taxes plus the shortfall that we're likely to see on the non-tax collection side should set you back by approximately by 1 trillion. On the direct tax, broadly agree with Shaumiran that direct taxes are doing pretty well. On the income tax filings have increased, so you should see a robust 20% plus kind of year-on-year growth. On corporate tax as well, I think we penciling in around a 12-13% year-on-year growth, so no real big surprises there. And we're even more optimistic for revenue for next year. We don't think receipts be so much of a concern next year.
Fair point. Sajid, with this, let me come to the more credible expectations for next year. Since the consensus appears to be that tax revenues this year are going to be flat to maybe marginally lower, what can be a credible expectation for next year?
So a few things I would look at, Lata. One is, what is the nominal GDP assumption, because, the tax buoyancy is typically based on that. The CSO estimates this year to be 9.5. I think that, that will be slightly higher when the final outturn comes. We're looking closer to 10.3. Next year, we expect both GDP growth to pick up and the GDP deflator to pick up. So I think a number of 11.5% would seem quite credible. Now, on that nominal GDP assumption, remember, direct taxes this year will grow close to 15%, both corporate and income, on a nominal GDP base of 10%. Now, there are some one-offs over there as well, but that's a buoyancy of 1.5. The government can legitimately say next year with growth picking up, at least in the direct tax front, buoyancy can be slightly higher. That's one positive. The second is, just the mechanical aspect that next year you'll get 12 months GST revenue. This year you got 11 months. So that adds about 50,000 crore, or about, close to 0.3% of GDP. So when looking at the buoyancy of indirect taxes, first take out 50,000 crore to look at the underlying buoyancy. Now, I think that is the key assumption here. We're being a little bit conservative. We're saying buoyancy will be accounting for the one-off close to 1, maybe 1.1. Anything higher than that might be a bit of a stretch. So I think those are the 3-4 numbers I would look at.
Okay, fine. That's a lot of numbers, but I want you all to quickly give me those 3 key numbers. What are your nominal GDP expectations, and therefore which is that direct tax number, 15%, 16%, not direct tax, sorry, which is the exact revenue growth number that you will consider credible? Samiran, first, what's the nominal GDP number you're working with, and what is the tax revenue growth percentage?
We are working with a number of 11.5 to 12% on nominal GDP, and on that basis calling for about a 12.9, 13% growth in total revenue,
okay,
including the non-tax revenue. So for tax, we are working with about a 11.5% year-over-year growth, so which will translate into about 11.4% of GDP of total tax revenue.
Sure. Deepali, what would your numbers be?
Right, so for nominal we have 10.2 for this year and 11.5 for next year. Net tax revenue growth for this year is 9%, and we're seeing a big jump of about 17% next year.
Ashima, I want a qualitative comment from you. Would a 13% revenue growth tax revenue growth assumption be fine? Because I'm getting a range from 13% to 17% revenue growth next year. What will make you call the tax revenue assumptions for the centre a good one?
Yeah, I think we should remember that we've gone through a lot of structural reforms this year, and we should see them fructifying in the next year. So, and also that global growth is going to be high,
yes,
and we are now in a position to take advantage of it. I would expect exports to rise. And moreover, whenever oil prices are a little higher, and we don't expect them to go above this because there are many factors keeping them stable, then our exports, non-oil, oil as well as non-oil exports do much better. So if you expect higher growth, then your nominal GDP growth could be higher, and therefore tax revenue also, since you would see that GST should settle down. and deliver some improvements, as well as following up on all the leads they got with demonetization on direct tax. We've already seen a lot of buoyancy there.
Okay.
So I would believe that we could see, it would be closer to 15%, in the higher end of that band.
Okay.
The growth in tax revenue.
Yeah. So,
and the last point I wanted to make was non-tax revenue, because asset prices are very, very high. Right? So it's a very good time to divest. Air India, we could see a lot of movement there.
Okay.
And a lot of revenue coming from those.
Okay. Well, so primarily if the nominal GDP assumption is close to 12% and the revenue growth assumption is even over 15%, there are believers in my very credible panel of experts. That's very important to note. We have to take a quick break, and thereafter we are going to discuss the big number deficit. Back in a jiffy.